May 15, 1944, somewhere in London, John Cairncross sat in a private office at the Government Code and Cipher School in Bletchley Park, carefully photographing documents that contained some of the most sensitive intelligence in the entire Allied war effort. He was 31 years old, a brilliant linguist who'd graduated from Cambridge with top honors, worked as a private secretary to a cabinet minister, and now had access to decrypted German communications that revealed Wehrmacht positions, U-boat movements, and strategic planning across occupied Europe. The documents he was photographing that afternoon included intelligence assessments related to Allied invasion planning for Operation Overlord, the massive cross-channel assault scheduled for early June that would become known as D-Day. Within 48 hours, these photographs would be in Moscow being analyzed by Soviet military intelligence, and Joseph Stalin would know details about Allied strategy that even most British and American generals hadn't been told. The Germans, despite their extensive spy networks and intelligence operations, would learn nothing because John Cairncross wasn't working for the Nazis. He was working for the Soviets, and he'd been passing them British secrets since 1937 in what he genuinely believed was helping the Allied cause by ensuring the Soviet Union had the intelligence it needed to defeat Hitler. Before we dive into how a British civil servant became one of the most damaging spies in Allied intelligence and why he handed Stalin information that could have destroyed the Western Alliance, like this video because it helps reach more history enthusiasts like yourself. Let's get back to the 1930s when a group of Cambridge students decided that the future belonged to communism and began a betrayal that would last decades. John Cairncross had been recruited into Soviet intelligence in 1937 while working as a civil servant in the British Treasury, part of the infamous Cambridge 5 spy ring that included Kim Philby, Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, and Anthony Blunt. These weren't working-class revolutionaries or foreign agents. They were products of Britain's elite educational system, privileged young men who'd been radicalized at Cambridge University during the 1930s when the Spanish Civil War and the rise of fascism convinced them that only the Soviet Union represented genuine opposition to Nazi Germany. Cairncross had been approached by Soviet intelligence officer Arnold Deutsch, who identified him as ideologically sympathetic and professionally positioned to access valuable information. Unlike the other Cambridge spies, who were motivated partly by ideological conviction and partly by ego and adventure, Cairncross seemed genuinely convinced that passing secrets to the Soviets was morally justified because Britain and the Soviet Union were ultimately on the same side against fascism. His first posting had been relatively minor, passing treasury documents and diplomatic communications that gave the Soviets insight into British economic planning and foreign policy, useful intelligence but not catastrophically damaging. But in 1942, Cairncross was transferred to Bletchley Park, the top-secret facility where British codebreakers were decrypting German communications using the captured Enigma machines and advanced mathematical analysis. Bletchley Park was producing intelligence so valuable that Churchill called it his most important source. Decrypted German messages revealed U-boat positions, allowing convoys to avoid them, exposed Luftwaffe strength before major operations, and provided strategic intelligence about Wehrmacht deployments across Europe. Access to Bletchley material was strictly controlled because the British knew that if Germany discovered their codes were broken, they'd change the encryption systems and the intelligence would disappear. Cairncross worked as a translator and analyst processing decrypted German communications, which meant he saw raw intelligence before it was sanitized and distributed to military commanders. His Soviet handler, a GRU officer operating under diplomatic cover in London, had given him specific instructions about what information Moscow wanted. Anything related to German forces on the Eastern Front, Wehrmacht strategic planning, German industrial production, and Allied strategic decisions that might affect Soviet operations. Cairncross began systematically photographing documents and passing them to his handler during meetings in cafes and parks, using standard spy tradecraft that involved chalk marks on lampposts to signal meetings and dead drops in public locations to transfer film. The intelligence he provided was extraordinarily valuable to the Soviet Union, and this is where the moral complexity of his espionage becomes impossible to ignore. From 1942 to 1943, Cairncross passed the Soviets detailed information about German forces on the Eastern Front that the British had obtained through Enigma decrypts. This intelligence included Wehrmacht order of battle, tank deployments, supply situations, and strategic intentions for major operations, including the Battle of Kursk in summer 1943, with Soviet commanders used this intelligence to position their forces and prepare defenses that would destroy the German offensive at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history and a turning point on the Eastern Front. Without the intelligence Cairncross provided, Soviet casualties at Kursk would have been significantly higher and the battle's outcome less certain. So, was Cairncross helping or hurting the Allied cause? He was unquestionably committing espionage against his own government and violating every security protocol designed to protect British intelligence sources. But he was passing information to an ally that was bearing the primary burden of fighting Germany, and the intelligence he provided helped Soviet forces kill Germans more efficiently, which served the overall Allied strategy of defeating Nazi Germany. The British government's position was that intelligence sharing with the Soviets should be controlled and limited to prevent Stalin from gaining excessive insight into British capabilities and planning. Cairncross and his Soviet handlers disagreed, believing that the anti-fascist struggle required maximum intelligence sharing, regardless of British preferences. The situation became significantly more complicated in 1944 as D-Day planning intensified and Cairncross gained access to intelligence assessments related to Operation Overlord. The Allied invasion of Normandy was the most closely guarded secret of the war. The success of the operation depended on achieving surprise about the exact location and timing of the landings. German intelligence knew an invasion was coming, but didn't know where or when, and massive Allied deception operations were designed to convince the Germans that the invasion would target the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. British intelligence was sharing selected information with the Soviets to coordinate operations, but they weren't revealing the full details of Overlord because Churchill and his intelligence chiefs didn't entirely trust Stalin not to use the information for political leverage. Cairncross photographed documents related to Allied strategic planning in spring 1944 and passed them to his Soviet handler. Exactly what he passed and what the Soviets learned about D-Day remains partially classified and historically disputed, but it's clear that Moscow received intelligence about Allied invasion planning that went beyond what the British officially shared. Soviet intelligence reports from this period show detailed knowledge of Allied force dispositions, strategic objectives, and timing windows that could only have come from sources inside British or American planning staffs. The Soviets didn't share this intelligence with the Germans, obviously, because they wanted the invasion to succeed and open a second front that would relieve pressure on Soviet forces. But Stalin used his knowledge of Allied planning to make strategic decisions about Soviet operations, and he gained leverage in Allied politics by knowing more about Western strategy than the Western allies realized he knew. The question that haunts Cairncross's espionage is whether passing D-Day-related intelligence to Stalin crossed a line that even his previous activities hadn't. Information about German forces on the Eastern Front helped an ally fight more effectively against a common enemy, morally ambiguous but arguably defensible in the context of defeating Hitler. Information about Allied strategic planning that the British had deliberately withheld from the Soviets was pure espionage that benefited Soviet political interests rather than the military defeat of Germany.
Cairncross apparently justified it by believing that Allied and Soviet interests were ultimately aligned and that British intelligence's decision to limit information sharing with Moscow was counterproductive and politically motivated. The irony is that the Germans, despite running extensive intelligence networks in Britain and having broken some Allied codes, never learned what Cairncross was telling the Soviets. German intelligence knew an invasion was coming and desperately wanted to know where and when, but their networks in Britain had been systematically compromised by British counterintelligence, and the information they were receiving was carefully controlled deception. The real intelligence about Overlord was going to Moscow, not Berlin, because Cairncross and the other Cambridge spies had decided that the Soviet Union was a more reliable ally than their own government was willing to acknowledge. Cairncross continued his espionage through 1944 and into 1945, passing information about Allied strategic planning as the war moved towards its conclusion.
The intelligence he provided gave Stalin insight into Western political objectives for the post-war settlement, Churchill's concerns about Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe, and American strategic thinking about the occupation of Germany. This intelligence helped Stalin negotiate from a position of strength at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences because he knew what the Western Allies actually wanted versus what they were willing to settle for. The espionage that had begun as ideological conviction about helping the anti-fascist struggle had evolved into straight intelligence work benefiting Soviet political interests in the emerging Cold War. British intelligence began suspecting a leak at Bletchley Park in late 1944 when analysis of Soviet behavior suggested they had access to information beyond what was officially shared. Cairncross came under suspicion, but there wasn't enough evidence for prosecution, and he was quietly transferred away from sensitive work in 1945. He continued working in various government positions until 1951, when the defection of Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean to Moscow triggered intensive investigation of the Cambridge spy ring. Cairncross was interrogated multiple times but denied everything, and British intelligence couldn't prove his espionage without revealing sources and methods they wanted to keep secret. He eventually confessed in 1964 after being confronted with evidence from Soviet defector testimony, but was given immunity from prosecution in exchange for cooperation. The British government wanted to avoid a public trial that would reveal the full extent of the Cambridge spy ring's penetration of British intelligence and the fact that some of the most damaging espionage had occurred during the war when Britain and the Soviet Union were supposed to be allies. Cairncross lived quietly in Europe until his death in 1995, never facing criminal charges for espionage that had lasted nearly a decade and compromised some of Britain's most sensitive wartime secrets. The historical debate about Cairncross centers on whether his espionage helped or hurt the Allied war effort. Defenders argue that the intelligence he passed to Moscow helped Soviet forces defeat Germany more efficiently, that his information about Kursk may have saved Soviet lives and shortened the war, and that his ideological motivation was genuine anti-fascism rather than betrayal for personal gain. Critics argue that espionage against your own government during wartime is indefensible, regardless of motivation, that Cairncross violated trust and security protocols designed to protect vital intelligence sources, and that the intelligence he provided about Allied political planning gave Stalin leverage that shaped the post-war settlement in ways that hurt Western interests. What's undeniable is that Cairncross passed critical intelligence to the Soviet Union throughout World War II, including information about Allied strategic planning that the British government had deliberately withheld from Moscow. The Germans never learned what he was telling the Soviets, so his espionage didn't directly help Hitler, but it fundamentally altered the intelligence balance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union during the war, and influenced Stalin's strategic and political decision-making.
The spy who handed Stalin details about Allied planning believed he was serving the greater good by ensuring the Soviet Union had the intelligence it needed to defeat fascism, but he was making that decision unilaterally and in direct violation of British security policy. The broader lesson from Cairncross's espionage is about the complexity of alliance warfare and the tension between military cooperation and political competition. Britain and the Soviet Union were allies against Germany, but also competitors for post-war influence, and intelligence sharing was calibrated to support the military alliance while protecting political interests. Cairncross rejected that calibration and decided that full intelligence sharing with Moscow was morally required, regardless of British political concerns, and that decision shaped the war and its aftermath in ways that remain controversial. The British agent who handed Eisenhower's D-Day plans to Stalin, he handed them to Stalin, and whether that was betrayal or anti-fascist solidarity depends on whether you believe the Western Allies and the Soviet Union were genuinely on the same side or just temporarily aligned against a common enemy.